All right. Now, I tell you what's happened, and you would have been hearing it on the news. The Prime Minister has increased the terror alert for the first time in nearly 2 years, announced by the Australian government from possible to probable. Now, he's done that, and he acknowledged today the conflict in Gaza was a significant driver of that increase in the threat. And the first time, as I say, it's been done for a very long time. Comes a month after the government responded to increasing community tension around Israel's war in Gaza by announcing lawyer and businesswoman Gillian Siegel as the special envoy, or envoy if you like, for anti-Semitism, and plans for a special envoy for Islamophobia. But we do have a special envoy for social cohesion. And why do we need one of those? Well, let's find out from the envoy himself. It's Victorian Labor MP Peter Khalil, who joins me on the line. G'day, Peter.
G'day, Tim. How are you?
Mate, I'm great, and thank you very much for joining us today. And it's coincidental, and sadly coincidental, that you're joining us on the day the Prime Minister has increased the terror threat.
Yes, and I think it is well, I won't say sad, but it's a concerning day. But I think as the Prime Minister noted, and he outlined in his press conference, raising the threat level doesn't necessarily mean that there's an imminent threat or of a terrorist attack in Australia. It just means that the ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, has made a decision that reflects the current security environment and their assessment of the threats in a general sense.
Just a little bit about you before we talk about your role. Your parents came to Australia in the 70s, a very long time ago. And
Yes.
Your maiden speech to Parliament spoke about their experience of making a life here, as well as highlighting the threats modern multicultural societies like ours face from politics and politicians and trying to divide rather than unite us. And that was back in 2016. But, gee, Peter, it's perhaps even more relevant now.
It is, and I think it's interesting you reference my parents. I mean, the migrant story is one that's shared by millions of Australians, and my parents came from Egypt for a better life in Australia. They were fleeing persecution, they were fleeing wars in the Middle East back then, over 50 years ago, and they wanted a life of peace and security for themselves and for their kids. And and Australia gave us that. My parents used to say to me, you remember that book by Donald Horne? Some of the listeners might know, The Lucky Country. They used to say to me, everyone says Australia's the lucky country. Well, actually, it's not. We're the lucky ones to be Australian and to give something back to the country that's given us such an opportunity. Yeah. Ironically, of course, Donald Horne was talking about the second-rate leadership in the 60s when he said we're a lucky country. I hope that's not still the case. But anyway.
No, we turned it around to our own advantage. Oh, yeah, we are lucky. Exactly right. Well, we are. Okay, so the role. You've been given this role as the government's special envoy for social cohesion. What does the role actually involve for you? How do you see it?
Well, social cohesion, just so people can understand, obviously the different parts of a society and how they form together to form a united whole. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean people won't disagree, but it's really about how we can find the structures, the policies that we can put in place to incentivise people disagreeing peacefully, disagreeing respectfully, working together in a collective sense in the national interest. And so we've obviously seen a lot of fraying of social cohesion from different quarters, frankly, whether it's social media, whether it's international conflict causing disagreement, whether it's political populism or populism in politics where people seek to divide or sow disharmony or discord in order to get short-term political gain. There is a lot of challenges to our social cohesion. But I will say my role, and the Prime Minister is quite cognizant of ensuring that we look right across government, because it shouldn't be a siloed approach. It's not any one particular policy area or department that has responsibility for this. So he's kind of given me a pretty difficult task, I guess, in some respects of looking across government and where we can actually put some policies in place to enhance our social cohesion. And it's one that, we've built up over decades a wonderful, relatively harmonious multicultural society in Australia. And that's worth protecting. It's worth fighting for.
Yeah, it is. Now, just so the listeners understand the role, an envoy if you like, doesn't really have any authority over policy, so you don't get a seat at the table. What power will you have, if any, or is it just, if you like, an advisory role?
Yeah, there's a lot of it is advice. It's working through policies and policy development. It's advising both the Minister for Home Affairs, I'll be working to, and the Prime Minister around this policy work. Obviously, the executive will make the decisions around those policies and whether we implement them and fund them. But I can certainly try and make my case as to where we should be heading. And I think hopefully the PM and the Home Affairs Minister will be conducive to that. And in fact, I'm in Canberra today and just meeting with them today. So I think it's an important role because you've got to get some sort of tangible outcomes here where we engage with communities, bring people together. It's about uniting Australians.
Yeah.
And I will say this too, Tim, it's not just about multicultural policy. We have different parts of our society. There's socioeconomic diversity. There is a difference. There is intergenerational difference. There's issues, as I mentioned, of social media and different political perspectives. So there is a very big challenge ahead of us to maintain and enhance our relatively harmonious society.
Yeah, looking at what's happening in the UK is just, utterly horrifying. And you know what happens, Peter. People end up demonstrating just for the sake of demonstrating. There's really no cause, and it's just a flow-on effect. But, I was on the radio at another radio station when the Cronulla riots happened. We've experienced it here. I mean, what can we learn anything from the situation in the UK? Because that sort of escalation is really a terrifying thing.
Yeah, it's really alarming. And you're right. We've experienced this kind of instability in our own country over the decades. That's certainly true. And when I say it's been relatively harmonious, and I do that relative in comparison to many other parts of the world, particularly today where you're seeing really big challenges in the UK, in Europe, in the US with the polarisation, the divisiveness. And what we're seeing there is really, really concerning. What can we do? The importance here is bringing the temperature down, and there are legal sanctions. There's laws in place around hate speech and vilification, which need to be implemented and expressed, if you like. But there's also a normative framework, cultural norms. And I know this is going to sound strange, but it comes down to the basic decency that we have between each other. When we might disagree on something, you and I might disagree.
Yep.
But it's how we go about doing that. Now, you can't legislate for that, Tim, but you can you can set standards, and that is not just political leaders like us or the political participants. It's also community leaders, it's business leaders, it's people in the community, it's citizens in the way they go about it. And I think setting those standards is about leadership right across the community and help. I think our role is to help facilitate that in the best possible way.
Yeah. You said in that maiden speech, by the way, which is, quite a few years ago now, but 8 years ago now, that we shouldn't let ourselves fall into the trap of blaming people who are disaffected and angry. Do you still believe that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I haven't changed my view on that because people will differ in their views. And sometimes that's because they might not have all the full information. They might have been fed disinformation, which is one of those issues with social media, right?
Yeah.
They may not be aware or have the historical knowledge about particular issues. So I think, going straight to blaming people and shutting them out just makes the problem worse. People double down and triple down on their views, and they get manipulated by political actors and others who seek to take advantage of that anger. And that manipulation happens in politics. It happens throughout our communities. And so I think being able to engage people, inform them, educate them, but not in a lectury way, by the way, Tim, because that also kind of puts people off.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, people don't like to be lectured.
The genuine, authentic engagement, I think, is really important.
Yeah, you mentioned it, and I scroll through it a little bit myself every morning. But yes, the internet and the digital culture play in all of this because you mentioned disinformation. Honestly, there's just some absolute nonsense on there, and some of it, it's my belief, is downright dangerous.
Yeah, and so this is a big concern because unlike in other parts of history where you've had propaganda being pushed out, you've had misinformation and disinformation. The way that this is promulgated now through social media, through the algorithms which basically are built to actually push and exacerbate the inherent bias that people might have, and then a lot of it is based on hatefulness or anger or fear, and that kind of the algorithms work in that way as well to spread that kind of view. And then you've got on top of that misinformation and disinformation that's deliberately put out there to undermine the cohesiveness of a society, and that happens as well. And so these are real big challenges, and some of that is legislative, where we have to look at how we legislate or regulate around social media. Some of it, as I said, also is cultural, and it's about our our standards that we set, even as parents, how we manage social media with our children and ourselves. It really starts there. And I would tell you, Tim, don't spend too much time doom scrolling.
No, I don't.
For your mental health.
No, I don't. Especially on X. Some of the things. Well, I hope I'm smart enough to read some of that. So, how can you actually sit there and type that? Because it's not right. In fact, it's completely wrong. Yeah, I'm getting texts about all of this for someone talking about Islamophobia, and I was going to ask you the same question myself. Why is it taking so long? We have the anti-Semitism envoy, and why don't we have the anti-Islamophobia? Could it be because that job's too hard to fill? What's the reason for that? Do you know?
No. Well, there is two roles, as you pointed out. There is the government's announced the envoy for anti-Semitism, and also is going to soon announce. My understanding, soon will be announcing the envoy for Islamophobia as well. The government wants to get this right, and they are engaging with the community, engaging with candidates, as I understand, ahead of making this announcement, because there's been a huge rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And one of the things I've said with respect to this is that there is deep pain and anguish and suffering that people are feeling with respect to the tragic loss of innocent civilian lives in the Gaza war.
Yeah.
And many of these people are Australians who have family members there. I know many family members, people who have family members that they've lost in Gaza. And so, but that does not mean that people of a Jewish or a Muslim background should be attacked or vilified because of who they are. And this is something where it's really important. I think the envoys will play a role in working with those communities and the broader public to try and address what is a huge challenge now, where people are being attacked because of their faith background. And I've always thought, and you mentioned my maiden speech a couple of times, that the great thing about Australia, Tim, is that regardless of your faith background, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your socioeconomic background, your gender, your sexuality, there's this sense of fair go. And yes, there was racism growing up. I felt it. I experienced it. But on the whole, Australia gave us a fair go. And this is something that we need to protect, because no one should be targeted based on any of those identities that they have, because ultimately we're all Australian. And that's the thread that links us together.
Yes, a lot of comments here, and if listeners, if you don't mind, I'll paraphrase a little bit. Very disappointed to see so much anti-Semitism. The problem is there's no cultural norm anymore in Australia. People come from a lot of different cultures. The riots in Cronulla, spurred by comments at a radio station. The media plays a part. It does, John, plays a very significant part. And who decides what's true and what's not on the social media? So lots of these questions, and 2 or 3 texts that say about the pylon. Genuine protests, and then, as we're seeing in the UK, and you often see it here, you see it in America. It's just a pylon. People have said, there's a riot on, I'll get my megaphone or put my mask on and I'll go and join in.
Yeah, and this is a really important point for that listener who texted you, because I support, the government supports, we should all support the right to protest 100%. It's a fundamental democratic right.
Yep.
It is part of our democratic process for people to be able to express themselves freely in peaceful protest. Now, the issue is when that crosses over into any form of violence, any form of hate speech, any form of physical intimidation and harassment of people, then it becomes unacceptable. But people have a right to peaceful protest, and people, you don't have to agree with people, what their views are, but they have a right to express themselves as long as it's peaceful. And unfortunately, we've seen, the vast majority of protests we've seen have been peaceful, absolutely.
Yep.
But unfortunately, we've seen some of this spill over into acts of violence, which is completely unacceptable. Either the violence or the targeting of particular groups and minorities, whether they be Jewish Australians or Muslim Australians or whatever it might be, is completely unacceptable.
Yes. Now, I just want to clear this up, because I've got a text asking me about the terrorist threat that the Prime Minister has. Well, I'll tell you what he's done. So let's be clear on this. There isn't an imminent threat texter, according to the Prime Minister, but we're still seeing an overall increase in polarisation with more Australians willing to turn to violence to promote their cause. So the threat has been raised for the first time in nearly 2 years, but he's not saying, and we should be very clear on this, Peter, at this point in time, that there's not an imminent threat.
Not. No. And I think that's important to reaffirm with listeners. There is not an imminent threat of terrorist attack. What this is a reflection that the increase in the alert here is a reflection of the current security environment, which we've seen globally a rise in politically motivated violence and extremism. We've seen here in Australia radicalisation of particularly young people, online radicalisation in online spaces. We've seen the embracing of a diverse range of extreme ideologies right across the political spectrum, and where those ideologies also allow or encourage the use of violence as a means to promote particular ideological views. We've seen an increase in all of that. So this is a reflection of the current security environment we're facing, and that advice has been provided by ASIO to the government, and they've made a decision, obviously, to raise the threat level because of that. But that doesn't mean that there's an imminent threat or an imminent threat of terrorist attack. It means that the security environment is changing, it is evolving, and there are challenges there that need to be addressed.
Could I finally and quickly ask you, it's a big job you've been given, a very big job you've been given by the Prime Minister to be this envoy, and I know you'll attack it with great gusto. What do you want to achieve, Peter, with this job?
Well, I go back to what I said to you earlier. What I want to achieve is to do everything possible for us to play our role as a government to protect and enhance the cohesiveness of our society, the harmonious nature of our multicultural society, one that has a fair go at its heart. And this doesn't happen by magic, Tim, as you'd understand. Generations of Australians played a role in setting the standards, in making sure that the laws are in place, but also the cultural attitudes are in place that gives everyone an opportunity regardless of their background. And I think success really here is navigating us through what are very difficult waters in the coming years because of the challenges that our society does face, both from external actors but also internally with all the things that I mentioned around social media, for example.
Yep.
So navigating us through that period so that we get to the other side with this great multicultural Australian society still being cohesive would be a measure of success.
Good on you, and thanks for joining us for such a long amount of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Cheers.
Victorian Labor MP Peter Khalil, who is our brand new social cohesion envoy. 3:24.